Got it. Sorry. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a nice lunch and a nice break. I'm Alejandra or Alexandra Delno. I appear with both iterations of my name on the program, one today and one tomorrow. So I was happy that we were discussing names as well, because that's a beautiful way for me to navigate all of my identity. So I'm very, very excited to be here and to be part of this alchemy. I love that word to describe the work we're doing for the next 3 days. And we're going to begin this panel titled Necropolitics of Invisibility with 2 presentations. So it'll be a slightly shorter panel than the others. And we will begin with Olga Michael's presentation entitled Graphic Thanatopoetics and the Invisible Spectacle of Death. Olga is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of English at the University of Cyprus, and she's currently working on 2 monographs, Human Rights in Graphic Life Narrative, Reading and Witnessing Violations of Others in Anglophone Text and Migrant Stories, and the other book, The New European Literary Canon, The Rise of Ethnopographic Narrative in 21st Century Europe. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you. So this is part of the one book that I am currently writing on comics. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, thank you. So borders have been described as liminal zones that not only separate, but also connect divided entities and identities. They're in between spaces partaking in bordering processes of exclusion and inclusion, and they are caught between the law and that which transgresses the law, between fixity and change, according to Johann Szymanski and Stephen Wolf. Life and death at the border are also liminal. Borders produce dead populations like those who lose their lives en route to Europe. Likewise, in constituting instances of what Achille Bebe describes as death worlds, that is, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. Western borders also produce populations existing in limbo between life and non-life. The state of being or non-being at the border is thus liminal. In this paper, I perceive the posthumous lives of those who have died at borders as relationally connected to the living, and I explore the implications of their depictions in online and print graphic narratives that aim at raising awareness and triggering ethical responses to the so-called European refugee crisis. Being characterized by their combination of images and words, comics are also in themselves a liminal in-between form that is at once both images and words, and neither, constituting something more than that, given how meaning is based on complex processes of interaction between the 2 registers. To refer to the graphic displays of Thanatos or death through comics, as well as to their close examination, I introduce the term graphic Thanatopoetics. Through this term, I mean to point to how graphic narratives and their readings can critique the ways in which border deaths become invisibilized through European deterrence and security practices and narratives. Thus, in their posthumous existence, the dead appear in graphic narratives to interrogate the violent excluding function of the border. Antoine Pecou discusses the border deaths of the Mediterranean and explains that their political significance lies in how they expose the deadly consequences of the politics of migration in Europe, and in how they embody the diffuse violence that underlies the control of people's mobility and the rejection of foreigners outside European borders, further describing the exposure of such deaths as ambivalent. Their ambivalence, he explains, lies in how they normally remain obscured, but also in how they may at times become excessively visible, as was the case with the 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi, who who was washed ashore in Bodrum, Turkey, and whose photograph became excessively circulated, used and misused across various media. Unlike his posthumous visibility, which did trigger humanitarian responses up to a point, Pico explains that in most cases, border deaths are hardly visible because they often occur in remote places such as deserts or high sea, and they concern people who for obvious reasons struggle to hide from governments and end up dying in the same hidden manner. He refers to difficulties when it comes to recording exact numbers of such deaths, and also to how numbers are at times purposefully imprecise, thus obscuring for political reasons the scale of the border death phenomenon. States, he explains, may abstain from counting as well as retrieving the dead, thus rendering them ungrievable and depriving their lives of the right to appropriately mourn them, because they are largely unconcerned or because they prefer silencing a reality that would question their border control practices. As such, contemporarily, border deaths have become a kind of routine, semi-visible and tacitly accepted reality, he explains. So the first text that I discuss in this presentation is Zenovia, which was first published in Denmark in 2016. It tells the story of Amina, a Syrian girl who loses her parents and tries to cross to Europe through the Mediterranean with the aid of a male guardian. It initially presents a story of familial bliss that is embodied through her hide and seek games with her mother and becomes disrupted by war and the disappearance of her parents. Prior to it, however, the narrative presents a flash forward, a long distance take at the sea and the sky and at the boat, which is filled with refugees, that disrupts the presence of blue, highlighting the isolation of the people inside it. The following panels zoom in on this boat and the protagonist herself, who looks scared among the crowd. A storm causes the boat to capsize and the people to end up in the sea. The final panels of this predominantly wordless narrative fragment show Amina sinking and thinking that it's big and empty here and that no one can find her. In presenting Amina as hidden or rendered invisible, both literally and metaphorically under the sea surface, the narrative links the moment of her drowning with the hide and seek games she played with her mother during peaceful times. The book ends with another take on the girl's drowning scene. In this repetition with differentiations, its depiction highlights Amina's isolation and powerlessness in the void of the sea. And again, the phrase, "it's big and empty here," she repeats as her visually embodied self sinks into darkness, which may also indicate oblivion. The following page repeats again with some differentiations. Amina's depiction in the sea's depiction at the beginning, the opening scene of the narrative. In this case, the sea is not disrupted by the boat carrying Amina alongside other refugees. The sun after the darkness implies that a new day follows the shipwreck, and the following panels depict different perspectives on the surface of the sea, which becomes marked by Amina's posthumous textual presence. "Find me," she says again, while in the visual register, all the traces of her existence are invisible. In the textual registers, the spectral narrative voice of Amina presents her realization that her request is a mere whisper that only she can hear. The play game metaphor of hide and seek thus becomes eerily staged through the narrative's visual verbal combinations to bring to the fore the protagonist's post-mortem invisibility. In closing, this closing narrative fragment once again links her death with memories of her games with her mother, at the same time as demanding that readers turn their gaze to the dying girl. So the European reader in this sense is forced to see those who otherwise remain unseen, while being reminded of their inaction in the face of these girls and other people's death and precarity at the border. In the final panels of the comic, fish also enter the frame of representation to foreshadow the kind of necroviolence that Amina's body will undergo. Fish also exists at the end of Illegal, which is another graphic novel that shows another shipwreck in the Mediterranean. The book accounts for Evan, his brother's quest to find their sister who fled their village in Ghana to seek a better life in Europe prior to them. After the torture they suffer in Libya as illegal migrants, Kwame dies in a shipwreck close to Italy, and he sinks into the sea alongside other people while fish bite pieces of their bodies. In its visuality, then, the comic's form allows a graphic display of what remains unseen under and conveniently hidden by the surface of the sea. Analyzing the role of the animal in graphic novels depicting genocide, Lorica Belt writes that it can be utilized to comment on our human experiences, and that the distance imposed by animals opens up an affective space for readers to engage with atrocities. For Dominic Lacapra, animals in literature show that it is not the animals who are bestial, but human beings in certain situations. Human bestiality, however, which causes this kind of dehumanization and necroviolence, remains elusive outside of the narrative frame in this comic. By zooming in on Amina and Kwame's deaths, the two graphic narratives visualize what remains unseen under the surface of the sea, highlighting the detachment of the human body from a social space where its biographical and biological life, as well as its biographical and biological death, become recognized. People who died in the Mediterranean and in other border zones become stripped of their posthumous relationality and political existence by disappearing from view. Human presence in this sense becomes completely erased. That the living often have no idea where the remains of their loved ones are, and that they are forced to remember and mourn them in their complete absence, captures what the violation of the dead really means, according to Jason De Leon. Necroviolence, such as the one occurring in the depths of the Mediterranean, deprives the dead of their identities, their places in the world, and their bodies. If death is regarded as a disturbance of the social order, a laceration of the social body, and a gap in social and family networks, as Robin points out, in their depiction of Kwame and Amina's corpses, the two graphic narratives present a reality that further disturbs this order by dehumanizing the dead, by reducing them to mere parts of the animal food chain, and by causing them to vanish from view. And while Kwame's body is shown being eaten by fish, Amina's is only surrounded by them in a graphic foreshadowing of what is to follow, but which remains too obscene to be in the narrative frame. The same goes for Western, colonial, and neo-colonial factors that cause this kind of dehumanization. The two texts then present these two children as embodiments of the ultimate refugee victimhood that results in an individual's complete erasure through death and through their posthumous contact with animals. The textual presence of Amina, however, undoes this erasure by calling upon the reader to turn their gaze towards her direction and to look for her. Further to their contact with animals, the border dead also come in contact with the living dead of the border. These encounters are displayed in an online comic called An Empty Promise that was published in 2017 by the NGO Positive Negatives, which uses comics as an educational tool to raise awareness about the refugee crisis and other social issues. In this text, Mary, an asylum seeker from Nigeria, tells her story from Sicily, where she lives in limbo in a suspended temporality, waiting for an asylum decision at the same time as being insulted and marginalized by people in the local community. She explained how people died while crossing through the Libyan desert after suffocating. In the visual register, you can see that at the background, there is only the watermelons which caused the people's death, who remain invisible in this case. In Quadroon, Libya, she continues, Girls were chosen randomly to have sex with men, and boys worked all day without food, and someone who tried to escape was beaten to death in front of them. Those involved in this thanatic scene are visually embodied minimally and liminally, as you can see here. In a state in between the human and the monster through their linear outlines that resemble children's drawings. The holes on their chest visually represent what becomes displayed through a metaphor of heartlessness. Inhumanity thus becomes linked to the perpetrators of border violence who remain elusive like the causes of their existence. In digging for the disappeared, forensic science after atrocity, Adam Rosenblatt asks whether the dead have human rights. The dead body, he tells us, is an object of study or an object of mourning, sometimes even an object of political negotiation, but rarely is it described as directly benefiting from activities of forensic teams in terms of its human rights. Hannah Arendt writes that human rights can only apply for people living within a state community where individual claims are heard and human rights themselves are protected. Thus, Rosenblatt argues, forensically at least one cannot claim that the dead have human rights. Rather, what they do have is the potential to reveal the workings and the limitations of human rights discourses. The graphic displays of border deaths and lives which are rendered unlivable illustrate how border control prioritizes the rights of a national citizenry over the rights of a universal humanity, and how as a result the refugee, this exceptional figure that should have been the most essential recipient of human rights, comes instead to embody their failure, as Dominic Davis writes. In the hermeneutics of the subject, Michel Foucault writes that of Meleti Thanatu, or the mediation on death, which enables a retrospective look at the past and an evaluative memorization of life. Stuart J. Murray situates Foucault's analysis of Meleti Thanatu within the context of caring for oneself and clarifies that such a relation to the self constitutes an attitude toward both self and world, as well as its embodied experiences, a social, political, and historical exercise, an ethic and an aesthetic. Meleti Thanatu foregrounds for Murray the ways in which death is constitutive of the subject. In today's socio-political context, death informs our political life, as shown by how in the name of life, certain deaths are rendered nameless, innumerable, obscure, and obscured, he explains. A thanatopoetical perspective on graphic narratives of liminal border deaths, both literal and metaphorical, would entail, as Murray explains, reckoning with the dead in an attempt to account for our own complicity in a regime that delivers death to some in the name of prosperity and life for others, and it would unveil the fault lines of biopolitical logics at the same time as foregrounding the rhetorical conditions in which the dead, the dying, and the dispossessed might rise up and speak. The specters of the dead and the living dead in print and digital comics then have important rhetorical potential. In their invisibility, they critique Western framings of war and conflict elsewhere. They foreground populations' precarity and ungrievability, and they illustrate acts of necroviolence triggered by deterrence policies in the border zones of the Mediterranean and beyond. Graphic Thanatopoetics would potentially enable the contextualization of Thanatos through decolonial and post-colonial reading acts, which would refuse to edit out of the picture Western neocolonial interventions elsewhere, which injure individuals by rendering them excessively precarious and by creating death worlds in which they are called to live as the living dead. In White Innocence and Black Mediterranean, Ida Dainwade discusses the problematics of Western hospitality and the erasure of history in the context of the so-called European refugee crisis, which purposefully disconnects connected histories of European colonization and imperialism with the othering and violation of populations beyond the West. Examining the role of grief in pro-refugee activism, she explains that the prevailing affectively charged focus on bodies in pain contributes to an ideological formation that disconnects connected histories and turns questions of responsibility, guilt, restitution, repentance, and structural reforms into matters of empathy, generosity, and hospitality. The result is a veil of ignorance, which allows the European subject to reconstitute itself as ethical and good, innocent of its imperialist histories and present complicities. In decontextualizing and dehistoricizing the ongoing tragedy, this focus on bodies in pain also contributes to the construction of the cultural narrative of European goodness, humanity, and anti-racism. The aesthetic silences, erasures, and injustices that are sometimes present in graphic and literary text about this crisis evoke the power relations in which they are produced and which they sometimes reproduce. By inviting readers to a mediation on death through their representations of Thanatos, the graphic narratives examined in this presentation also ask that we consider what remains unsaid and what such silences denote about the limitations of human rights discourses and about the ethics of the Western gaze on the dead and the living dead of the border. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. I think there were some interesting connections here with the first panel when we were already talking about forms and what are the implications of choosing one form or another to illustrate what is happening, what different forms can make visible choices are made to silence certain things, to illustrate other things, and also how sometimes absences speak louder than presence. And I also thought the part where you were discussing the animals, right, and how it connects to the debates that have been had about Jason de Leon's work and in the Land of Open Graves in using a pig in his ethnographic work to illustrate what happens to human bodies in the desert and how the role of animals and wildlife in destroying the remains, and how that has been widely criticized as why was that, why is it necessary or not, and to whom does that speak, and for what purpose. So I think that there's some really interesting questions here about what to show, what not to show, and for what purpose. Thank you. And I will now introduce Dominic Davis, who has already been quoted in the previous presentation. Dominic Davis is a senior lecturer in English at City University London, where he also directs the BA in English program. He holds a PhD and British Academy postdoctoral fellowship from Oxford, and he's the author of Imperial Infrastructure and Urban Comics, along with other articles in postcolonial literature, critical infrastructure studies, and visual culture. And he's currently co-authoring a book titled Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. The presentation today is titled Clandestine Crossings, Graphic Narrative as Counter-Forensic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. And thank you to the organizers for having me. It's really great to be here. I've enjoyed the morning very much. And thank you too for putting me on a panel with Olga, because that paper really feeds so well into this one. And it's lovely to meet Olga for the first time as well. I've been reading her work for a while, so that's great. The final thing I'll add before I start is that I had quite a nasty run-in with COVID a few weeks ago. And since then, my throat has been giving out. So we'll see how far we get. I may need Olga to read the last quarter of my paper for me, but hopefully it'll be okay. You can hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So from photographs of capsized boats and washed up bodies to distress signals registered on satellite monitors, the Mediterranean Sea is one of the most visualized oceans on the planet. For migrants and refugees attempting the crossing, there are as many ways to be seen as there are consequences of being seen. And the clandestine quality of migration, its concealed or surreptitious nature, is just as contingent on image saturation as it is an absence of vision. Since 2015, a small boom in comics and graphic narratives documenting refugee journeys across the Mediterranean has sought to intervene into the visual politics of this oceanic theatre. By discussing examples of this narrative documentary artwork in terms of counterforensics, this paper aims to raise and suggest preliminary answers to a series of questions. Who or what are representations of refugees for? Who do they inadvertently invisibilize? What kinds of publics or forums do they create? And what spaces, but also what times, are they able to draw into view? Sorry. So I take the term counterforensics from the international activist organization Forensic Architecture, who bring together interdisciplinary teams of architects, artists, journalists, and lawyers to transform built environments, demolished infrastructures, and even plumes of smoke into witnesses capable of testifying against human rights abuses in courts of law. For FA, the built environment is far more than dead bricks and mortar, and according to their subsidiary agency, Forensic Oceanography, the same holds for the sea. More than human oceanic environments can be made to speak a testimony that is recognizable within existing legal frameworks and public forums. Importantly, FA emphasized their practice as counter-forensics. Rather than extending the visual reach of state surveillance, they instead subject state regimes themselves to their own counter-forensic practice. The aim is not only to render state violence visible, but to both widen existing and generate new forums in which that violence might be recognized and challenged as such. Forensic Oceanography's thickening of the Mediterranean Sea's liquid into a legible forensic testimony is exemplified in their 2012 Left to Die boats case. I'll quote from their description of events. In March 2011, 72 passengers left the Libyan coast heading in the direction of Italy on board a small rubber boat at the time of NATO's military intervention in Libya. Despite several distress signals relaying their location, as well as repeated interactions with at least one military helicopter and a military ship, they were left to drift for 14 days. As a result of the inaction of all state actors involved, only 9 of the passengers survived. By combining their testimonies with wind and sea and current data, as well as satellite imagery, Forensic Oceanography reconstructed the liquid traces of this event, producing a report that served as the basis of several legal complaints. So in Forensic Oceanography's visual reconstruction of this tragic event, a firm white line tracks the journey of the refugee boat out from the Libyan coast to a distance of almost 14 kilometers. Oh. That's okay. Just this one. Yeah. That's good. Sorry about this. So in FO's visual reconstruction of this tragic event, let's try this, hopefully it won't crash this time. A firm white line tracks the journey of the refugee boat out from the Libyan coast to a distance of almost 14 kilometers. FO then overlay the NATO maritime surveillance area, a visual regime introduced to monitor the surge in migrant crossings that occurred shortly after the bombing of Libya by European states in 2011. So doing reveals how the boat remains within this area for almost the entire duration of its journey. FO then tracked the different legal jurisdictions in yellow lines to show the boat inside the Maltese search and rescue area. Finally, with circular red rings, they tracked the presence of several vessels, including a NATO helicopter and Spanish and Italian Navy ships within view of the left to die boat, even though no rescue was attempted. So the dotted white line then shows the boat's gradual drift back to the Libyan coast after its engines had failed. And by the time it washed up, more than 60 of the migrants on the boat had perished. By arranging multiple fragments of evidence, migrant distress signals, synthetic aperture radar, satellite imagery, smartphone footage, and first-hand witness testimony together into a sequential narrative, FO's visualization reveals how the Mediterranean has been made to kill by first creating dangerous conditions of crossing and then by abstaining from assisting those in peril. Against this deliberate obfuscation, which is itself predicated on the ability to meter out clandestine invisibility, so state and superstate actors simultaneously saw and also refused to see the migrant vessel in distress, FO counteractively insists that traces are indeed left in the water. Such traces, when reassembled and made to speak in this way, make visible the corporeal consequences of a border regime that operates according to a murderously partial coverage of the most surveilled seascape on the planet. FO's case supported several legal complaints made in the national courts of France, Italy, Spain, and Belgium, and it was used in the Council of Europe report that led to multiple hearings with state representatives. Of particular interest is FO's use of shifting resolutions to bring state actors into focus, while at the same time protecting those migrants who, though demanding visibility so they might be rescued at the time, might want to refuse recognition after the fact in the new forums that FO's project went on to generate. So with this, FO managed the seemingly impossible. They render the refugee predicament visible without extending the surveillance of the state or compromising the refugee's right of refusal. The aesthetic composition of the project allows the refugee to be seen on their own terms rather than those of Western media, Frontex agents, or NATO surveillance. The result unsettles not only the EU border regime, but the whole post-imperial nation-state system, which gains its power and authority precisely from the sovereign ability to see or to choose not to see, and to bestow or to choose not to bestow political recognition on migrant subjects. Crucially, it's the use of narrative and aesthetic framing as counter-forensic technologies that allow FO, and as we shall now see comics artists too, to transform the scene to a witness that can speak and be heard. As Hilary Chute writes in her field-shaping study, Disaster Drawn, drawing today still enters the public sphere as a form of witness that takes shape as marks on lines because no other technology could record what it depicts. In this sense, graphic art is a technology and graphic narratives a form of forensics. And when they work against state or superstate power, they become counter-forensics. So since 2015, when the so-called refugee crisis broke through into European headlines, the activist organization Positive Negatives, who Olga has already introduced, has been a leading producer of online refugee comics. Their narrative art is published for free on their website under the Creative Commons license, implying an aspirational freedom of movement in defiance of copyright. The comics have been reproduced in numerous online news outlets and exhibiting galleries, creating new forums in which testimonies might be heard. Their comics were submitted as evidence to the UK Parliament's International Development Committee in a follow-up review of its Syrian refugee crisis report, which was later cited in the House of Lords. They also accompanied the policy papers compiled for the UK's 2015 Modern Slavery Act and were included in a report and policy brief on the role of policy in migrant decision-making that became the Overseas Development Institute's most frequently downloaded report in 2016. Importantly, because of the counter-forensic resolution of these comics, no refugee has been subject to the surveillance gaze of state or superstate power, even as they have entered and created new forums within which the refugee testimony could hold that power to account. So these graphic narratives tell stories of migration to Europe from countries as diverse as Syria, Eritrea, Iraq, and Nigeria. Comprised of an experienced team of researchers and with a rotating cachet of artists working on commission, Positive Negatives prioritize first-hand witness testimonies, and their comics pivot on the tension of migrant invisibility. On the one hand, they change names to protect the identities of refugees, while on the other, they remain as faithful as possible to the individual account, even returning to the comics to refugees for them to verify the narrative before publication. This resolution is epitomized in the photographs that conclude many of their comics, where the shock of the real verifies the reliability of the testimony, though without bringing the refugees' faces into view. They remain simultaneously identified and unidentifiable, represented through a counter-forensic resolution that works to redact information from the surveillance gaze of the state, while simultaneously generating a forum in which the refugee voice might be heard. The result is not a unidirectional transaction in which the viewer empathetically bestows their recognition upon the refugee, but an encounter that reveals the power and politics of recognition itself as a way of patterning and arranging the world. To see clandestine crossings on the Mediterranean in these comics is thus not simply to reframe the refugee according to models of humanitarian or empathetic engagement, but rather to recognize the historic, geographic, and racialized inequalities that the border regime is designed to protect and reproduce. Consider this central image from Haskell's story, a comic about a Syrian man who makes the journey to Europe after the intensification of the war in 2015. This page breaks with the relatively regular paneling of preceding pages, the unusual layout of the comics grid, discomforting readers by offering them two narrative paths. Do we read right or down? As we pause to make this decision, the central splash panel, which is half filled with seawater, drags our eyes downwards, inscribing the threat of the ocean into our retinal movements and shaking us out of the story's narrative time. In this perilous oceanic environment, there is no humanizing image of a refugee face. Our narrator Haskell has just one close-up shot in the upper row's fourth panel, after which he quickly disappears into an anonymous mass of refugees. But the effect of this massification is not to dehumanize these refugees, for the humanity of the refugees is never really in question. Instead, with its gradated shadowing and spatial layouts, the image of the ship teetering on the crest of the wave threatens to twist the whole grid into disarray, instilling in the viewer a feeling of motion sickness. The lurch in our stomachs comes not from our empathetic recognition of the refugees' rights or humanity, but from the recognition of the murderous circumstances that the border regime, so both Europe's borders and the borders of the comics grid, have produced. We'll take a look at another image or series of images from An Empty Promise, which Olga also introduced, a short narrative, graphic narrative that tells Mary's account of being smuggled from Nigeria to Sicily. This four-panel sequence again reiterates a similar visual emphasis on the sea as murder weapon, rather than the refugee themselves. In the first two images, while the huge curves of the waves dominate the panel, the refugees are reduced to mere outlines or shadows of themselves. As we look, we almost see through them, the artist Gabby Froden tuning the resolution of her visuals so the migrants almost disappear from view. In the final two panels, they are picked up by an Italian rescue boat and water and food is distributed among the refugees. Here again, and with the exception of our narrator Mary, the resolution of the refugees themselves is tuned out, while the visual juxtaposition of small bottles of potable water with the vast oceanic waters beneath dramatizes the insufficiency of humanitarian intervention. Throughout, we're invited to contemplate the sea as witness, as the comic makes an amorphous mass of liquid testify against the apparatus that has turned it into a weapon of border enforcement. Finnish journalist Hanna Tavonen and French artist Jeff Bourque adopt a similar counter-forensic approach in their two companion comics, The Borders of Shame and Drowned Identities, both of which are available to view for free online. These webcomics use the infinite canvas technique in which readers view the comic by scrolling down a web page in perpetuity. Critics have noted that the effect of the infinite scroll is to induce a phenomenological collapse of place that's common to digital media. In the case of these, in the case of these refugee comics, let me try one more time. In the case of these refugee comics, the downward scroll conveys the dislocation experienced by migrants themselves. It's fine. Yeah. Which one? Number 10. That's great, thank you. The downward scroll conveys the dislocation experienced by migrants themselves, drawing readers' attention away from the individual identity of the refugee and towards the EU's weaponization of its maritime border. Both graphic narratives are characterized as forensic investigations, again following on from what Olga was saying, digging down into stories of migrants who lost their lives while attempting the crossing. The downward movement therefore works literally, drawing us beneath the surface of the ocean and conceptually imitating the poise of the forensic expert approaching an archaeological dig. Tavonen and Bourque flagged their allegiance to FO's counter-forensic project in the first sequence of The Borders of Shame, where they reconstruct the Left to Die boat case in comics form. Where FO had few on-the-surface images of the events in order to protect the refugees' identities, Bourque's graphics are drawn in an anonymizing resolution, reconstructing in visual detail precise moments of neglect and abandonment without encroaching on the refugees' right to refuse recognition. The graphic narrative thus adds another layer of forensics to FO's counter-forensic practice, further translating or interpreting their evidence by rendering visible instances of the state's active unseeing. Moving further down the page, the comic segues straight from the Left to Die boat case into a discussion of into a discussion of Frontex and its ever-growing apparatus of surveillance technologies. Crucially, the comic interleaves images of this array of border control technologies, the photographic documentation of which will be illegal under EU law, with maps of the Mediterranean that track the locations in which different border operations have taken place. The result is a profoundly disobedient gaze that re-territorializes the border through counter-forensic scrutiny so that it might be held to public account. Zenovia and Percu also review the Mediterranean by rejecting the idea that its crossing is only a single stage in a linear migrant journey from south to north. Instead, they understand the Mediterranean as a node in a deterritorialized border circuitry that uses strategies of containment through mobility to maintain rather than prevent circular migration outright. As necessary labor, migrants ceaselessly circulate around rather than simply across the Mediterranean. The Borders of Shame captures this more complex picture, showing how EU border governance operates not only through methods of detention and containment, but also through forced displacement, as moving people on becomes a carceral technique. By compiling a narrative from multiple forensic reports, rather than the testimony of a single refugee, Zenovia and Percu's comics take a circular look at this oceanic space, transforming the act of seeing from a humanitarian ethics of witnessing into a mode of political recognition that holds historic and systemic forms of violence to account. As the title of the comic emphasizes, Zenovia and Percu are less interested in soliciting empathy from their readers and more concerned to put the EU to shame. Thank you, I'm sorry about this. Is it not? You just take this one. Oh, yeah, great. So I'm going to skip to the end because my slides are really working the computer hard.
Which one is it?
Go down to 13 would be great. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, actually, yeah, let's go to 12 would be great.
Okay, just wait a minute.
No problem. So the Borders of Shame therefore implicates its European readers as, thank you so much, beneficiaries of a system that affirms their sovereignty precisely through the denial of other people's freedom to move. In the case of the EU, where the Schengen area purports to permit internal borderless movement, the division between those with the freedom to move, or indeed to stay where they are, and those subject to forced immobility becomes especially stark. As Enrique Rigo has observed, this geopolitical formation transforms borders from tools of separation into means of differentiation that, like European colonial regimes, creates a hierarchical legal system that does not so much exclude foreigners or outsiders or even refugees as non-citizens, but rather includes them as second-class subjects. The comic drives towards this historical precedent in one of its final panels, and this is the panel on the right. Here Zenovia asks, now my European passport opens doors for me and slams the door on others. Why do I have the right to live in security and not them? The images that accompany this question are especially revealing. The next oblong panel showing nothing other than the surface of the sea, than the empty surface of the sea. This image is conspicuously, even hauntingly empty, entirely devoid of orange dinghies, migrant boats, or search and rescue teams. Instead, our eyes are immediately drawn to the full-page bleed that provides a background to the panel, and which readers themselves bring into view by scrolling down the page. In this large, unbounded, dark blue spread, we discover the ghostly images of drowned migrants, or drowned identities, as the second comic in the series calls them. I just want to cycle back around by way of conclusion to the first panel we had this morning, to suggest that these ghostly images also open up literal and metaphoric connections between today's Mediterranean crossings and colonialism as a transoceanic system of exploitation, centered especially on the transatlantic slave trade. Indeed, the visuals we've been looking at bear striking resemblance to the ghostly drawings of African-American artist Tom Feelings, who in his 1995 book, The Middle Passage, reimagined the subaltern history of that clandestine crossing, though without losing sight of the colonial frames that have rendered its violence invisible for so long. As Ronaldo Walcott remarks of this work, by representing the horrors of the journey in simple two-tone pencil drawings, Feelings is able to occupy a historical void while simultaneously gesturing to the absent presence of detail. And I think this is kind of something we've been discussing. And this is kind of what I'm calling counter-forensics, this ability to navigate presence and absence at the same time. Perhaps because dominant European conceptions of political rights are so bound by recognition, to use Patchen Markle's phrase, critics have sometimes failed to see the counter-forensic value of contemporary graphic narratives, especially those depicting migrants crossing the Mediterranean. While it is now widely acknowledged that comics are repeatedly drawn to the risk of representation, it's possible that we have sometimes failed to ask, what is that representation for? Against the idea that comics work simply to promote or encourage a liberal recognition of the humanity or rights of the refugee, my argument here is that they instead teach us to recognize humanity and citizenship, along with other post-colonial notions such as territory and sovereignty, as racially and historically constructed concepts. Importantly, this widened perspective, often understood structurally and thus somehow divorced from individual agency or accountability, does not render us bereft of a thanatic ethics, but instead focalizes that ethical standpoint into perhaps a thanatic politics. As Nicholas de Genova points out, if migrant smuggling is to be genuinely likened to slave trading, it's precisely the European authorities who have the power to completely and more or less immediately eliminate it by reversing the very border enforcement that makes it an utter necessity. It is in such systemic critiques, along with their sometimes starkly simple political solutions, that reading graphic narratives as counter-forensics might help us to see exactly where our recognition is due. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much, Dominic, and thank you for the technical assistance.
Yeah, thank you.
I find the concept of counter-forensics a very powerful concept and tool to draw attention to the responsibility of the state in the situation of migrant deaths, but also how this can allow to change narratives away from blaming migrants themselves for putting themselves at risk and pushing towards thinking about state responsibility, but also the structural inequalities that you point out are underlying these systems, from colonialism to capitalism, and how can this evidence and how can drawing attention to these responsibilities push towards, mobilize towards undoing and changing these regimes. I really appreciate also that you put into conversation the work of forensic architecture and comics in terms of the different layers of work that they're doing in terms of presence and absence, but also the different audiences that they are reaching, and who has access to this kind of information, who are they trying to appeal to or mobilize through these tools. And on your abstract, I think also one question I want to just point out as opening for discussion is that you talk about what kind of publics or forums do these tools create, and you say what spaces, but also what times they draw into view, and time maybe something we haven't talked about so specifically yet, but I think that's also an important element of this conversation. So I'll leave it there for questions and comments.
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot for two really fascinating presentations. I was just wondering if you have reflected on how graphic novels are used to deter migrants. In many campaigns, we see this very similar images in a way without the structural critiques about the violence directly, who is actually responsible for violence. We often don't see that at all. But the individual horrific story, and especially the portrayal of the cruel smuggling, we have it there. So just in the work position and just some reflections on how they are at the same time, or maybe even parts of what you've shown today can be used to declare migrants.
Should I say anything? Yeah. There's a really great article by I think Aaron Humphrey about the Australian government's use of comics to deter migrants, and the production of comics. They almost look like like in-flight safety manuals. This kind of really sanitized and very clinical. This is what will happen. I think some comic scholars like to claim that there's something inherently radical about the form, and maybe this comes back to questions of collage that we were talking about earlier. I think obviously the use of certain forms are kind of predisposed perhaps to certain politics, but it's obviously about the content as well. And I wouldn't want to claim that somehow comics are inherently one thing or the other. Absolutely not. But yeah, do you want to?
I was going to comment on the same thing actually about the graphic narrative published by the Australian government. And to go back to what he said, that I mean, we tend to say a lot about the nuances and the potentialities of the medium, but it can be used towards the other direction as well. And this is, I think that this is where the importance of the interpretation of the text lies. And I'm not saying that I'm giving the correct interpretation. This is not what I am claiming, but it's important to read critically and fill in the gaps where there are gaps and silences.
I was, it reminded me of a case on the Mexico-US border. Around 2000, Mexico issued a comic to give information to migrants about the risks during the journey through the desert and how to protect themselves. And when the US government found out that they were producing this comic, which was called Guía Paisano, Paisano Guide. Paisano is a word that's used to refer to migrants in a more familiar term. And the US government told the Mexican government that if they kept issuing that guide, they were going to be responsible for undocumented migrants crossing the desert. And so there was a big political debate around the comic, which was mainly just about trying to offer humanitarian assistance and emergency numbers that they could call. So that was also an interesting thing. And it was very interesting how the form of the comic was being used in that context rather than just another kind of pamphlet or documentation. Nando.
Having worked in the past with the positive and negative on one of the projects, we worked with the unaccompanied minors. I mean, one of the interesting aspects of this collaboration was around, obviously, the development of the script, as well as thinking about the audiences. I think there is something about the use of graphic novels that is becoming so widespread. It's actually in some cases having the opposite effect, of almost becoming an aestheticization of the journalists. I mean, very often you look at the drawing, it seems to repeat and become a genre itself. The journey, the epic journey, and there is, and I think it's really important also to distinguish who is commissioning this work. I mean, one thing is some of the NGOs, for example, use them now regularly, but as a way almost of producing a very sanitized narratives about the message that will be conveyed. And there is an issue about the complexity of the narrative. It's almost the opposite of the positive, negative, imaginary. I mean, we need the skill of brain in some of these stories to let people in rather than just sort of passing the message to that everybody. But this comes from a position of really looking at it.
No, I think that's right, and I think I think that question actually comes from a similar place as the first one, because it's about I think you're absolutely right. Positive Negatives is a very small organization. It's got a lot smaller since COVID because everyone has not been able to do their research projects, and so they've not been able to employ Positive Negatives to make comics for them. It's very agile. There are definitely things that are dubious about parts of their practice. They try to be very rigorous and ethical, and I think like a lot of the politics that I'm reading into, I guess maybe another way of putting this, one of the reasons for bringing comics into dialogue with something like forensic architecture is to get away from the idea of comics as a form or genre that's self-contained. And instead, I'm not really interested in comics, to be honest. I'm interested in patterns of distributions of vision and text, image and text. Whether it happens to be comics or not, there's nothing that makes one comic more inherently, kind of political, or what's more interesting to me is the distribution of the visual, and whether that, I'm very influenced by Jacques Rancier's The Emancipated Spectator, where he says, the problem isn't that we don't see enough pictures of refugees or war or whatever, it's that we see too many pictures of refugees who can't speak, right? And there's a very particular, when you think you're seeing too many pictures or not enough pictures, that's the system functioning as it's supposed to. And so I'm interested in these few, you know, the occasions, and I wouldn't even say that the whole comics necessarily that I've talked about today do it, but those moments when we see that redistribution or a repatterning, or like a kind of what I'm trying to peg down as a kind of counter forensics. But yeah, excellent questions.
Thank you for these great presentations. I'm curious if we speak about Europe and about the web comics and taking it back to the question of audience. In what language are these web comics exist? Is it only in English or other languages? And the other point, I'm very much interested in the position of the place of the migrant into this web comic. Where are they? Like, do they see it? Do they read it? Do they comment on it?
Can we take 2 questions?
Yeah.
Thanks so much for this fascinating panel. This is a question about the politics, this kind of colonial regime crossings that Dom was talking about right at the end. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that symbiosis that you were implying between kind of migrant smuggling and European war. I think you were implying that there were ways in which the border forces were almost in collusion with the smugglers. Just want to hear a bit more about that.
No. What about the language? Where's the migrant?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, in relation to positive negatives, as he said before, that there's a lot of effort to make sure that they participate as much as possible in the creation of the text. So there's also scholarship about how this is a collaborative project, and it's a negotiation between the person who went through particular things and who testifies and the artist. And there's an effort to minimize the gap between the refugee and the artistic creator. In relation to the text that the printed narratives that I discussed, there aren't any discussions about the participation of refugees in the creation of the books. And also, I think that there are some instances where, I don't know, precisely maybe because of that, there are some problematic depictions of the things, like in the story of Amina, there's a reference to a queen in Palmyra, and the way this is presented is a bit, it reproduces kind of a cultural imperialism. Yeah, and I mean, you're trying to do something, but then, and this is where, going back to the other comment, I think that there's up to a point in relation to the potentialities of all these things, both the comics and literary narratives about migration. There's only so much that they can, I don't think that they can like trigger a lot of change because of all these things.
So I'll say a couple of things about that, and then I think I've understood the question. So in terms of language, well, let's start with where's the migrant. So as Olga says, I think one of the really interesting things to me, coming back to that distribution of the image and text, right, the visual and the verbal, one of the really interesting methodological things that positive negatives do is that they reproduce the text of the refugee. They reproduce, the refugee's story almost verbatim, and yet you don't see the refugee. And that's like a complete inversion of the way that we encounter refugees every day. When they're always framed in an image, they're always subject to a visual gaze, and they never have access to verbal representation. So I find that very interesting. So they're there in that sense. Clearly positive negatives are drawing for a Western audience. I think that is, which is partly why I'm interested in the way they perhaps get us to think about the way in which this space of death is produced by the EU and bodies that we supposedly have some sort of democratic say over. having said that, the huge comic scene in the Arab world, especially in Egypt and Lebanon. In Beirut and Cairo, particularly since 2011, the comic scene has just boomed. I can happily put you in the direction of some, I mean, not even less around kind of migration, although partly that, but also just around kind of social justice movement. So I can definitely, if you'd like to know more, I can give you some names. Elika, you kind of saying the border force is a complicit. Just say that again. Sorry, is that right?
I thought that's what you implied towards the end when you were talking about the Middle Passage.
Right.
And the kind of colonial regime that governs all these crossings and stuff since the 18th century. And what I heard you say is that in some sense the smugglers are in collusion with the European border forces. And I wanted to understand that better, but maybe I didn't get it correct.
1 minute. Yeah, I don't have anything to say about smugglers necessarily.
But I suppose, so then I might just rephrase the question. How does this regime of death, how might it be stopped?
Well, as I'll just quote Nicholas Genova then. No, I think that his point is saying that, like, you know, he says this in 2017, you know, that we reached this point where people are starting to say, you know, actually this is like, if we can genuinely liken migrant smuggling to slave trading, if that's what, you know, like Priti Patel's talking about criminal gangs, whatever, you know, how those criminal gangs can be stopped by the state, and they would, you know, that has been done in the past, and they, you know, you can actually do it, and you can do it by reversing the very system that currently makes it a necessity. Instead, she leans into the system. And you know, if anything, you know, allows them to charge even more for their. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And hopefully